The first growl wasn't loud, but it was sharp, like a thread snapping in a room pulled too tight. It cut through the sterile air of the Blue Ridge County Courthouse and made heads turn, unsure of what they had just heard. Shadow, a retired K-9 with a coat black as midnight and a stare that could stop a man mid-sentence, rose slowly to his feet. He wasn't supposed to move. Not here. Not now. The courtroom had settled into the heavy silence that always came right before a verdict. The judge was lifting his gavel. The bailiff, bored and expressionless, stood near the wall. The prosecutor leaned back in his chair, already tasting victory. And Amelia, barely 4 years old, tightened her tiny fingers around the leash wrapped around her wrist. She had no idea why Shadow had just growled, but she didn't let go. The courtroom door had been left slightly ajar. No one paid attention to the little girl with the stuffed rabbit in one hand and a leash in the other. No one, except Shadow, who suddenly yanked her forward. One step, then another. The leash stretched tight between them as the dog began walking, deliberate, slow, and silent, pulling Amelia straight toward the judge's bench. Hey, what is she doing?" someone whispered. Amelia's pink sneakers squeaked across the polished floor. Her hair was tied in a messy ponytail. She looked like she was walking her dog through a park, but Shadow's eyes were locked on the judge, unmoving, like a soldier on target. Court security began to stir. One guard reached for his belt. A deputy stood. "Ma'am, please restrain your animal," the judge said, startled but maintaining composure. But Shadow didn't stop. And neither did Amelia. No one knew that just beyond the courtroom wall, down the hallway behind locked doors, her mother, Talia Monroe, was waiting to be sentenced to death. No one except the dog. Shadow stopped 5 feet from the bench and lowered his body into a crouch. Not aggressive, not playful, just ready. His ears twitched forward, his tail stiffened. He opened his mouth and dropped something onto the floor. A small, weathered wooden box. The room froze. The judge leaned forward. "What is that?" he asked sharply. Amelia looked up, confused but calm. Shadow brought it. The box wasn't large, no more than a few inches wide, but the room shifted the moment it hit the floor. Something ancient settled over the air, like dust being blown off the truth. A courtroom technician stepped forward hesitantly. It was in evidence lockup. That unit's been closed since the fire. The judge frowned. Then how did the dog? Jason Beckett, a veteran officer now assigned to courthouse security, stepped through the crowd. "Shadow's been pacing outside that locker for 2 days," he said quietly. "We thought he was just confused, or grieving." The room hushed. Shadow hadn't barked, hadn't lunged. He had simply waited, watching, remembering, tracking. And now he had delivered something no one knew was missing. The judge motioned for the box. The bailiff picked it up and handed it over, his face pale. Inside was a folded stack of documents, some charred at the edges, others pristine. A few photographs, a fingerprint card, a vial sealed in evidence tape. The judge's face changed. He flipped the top page. Read, then again. His hand trembled. Across the aisle, the prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Is this?" the judge asked, eyes locked on Beckett. Jason nodded slowly. "That's the missing evidence file from the Monroe case, the one they said burned." The judge looked at the dog, then at Amelia, then at the papers in his hand. He didn't speak for several long seconds. Shadow stepped forward again, standing beside Amelia as if to say, "I've brought you this far. Now listen." The silence was crushed by the gavel as it dropped. Harder this time. "This court will recess immediately," the judge said. "I need to review this material before proceeding." The crowd erupted in whispers. The prosecutor stood, visibly shaken. "That's not admissible. It's unverified. This is outrageous." But no one was listening to him anymore, because in that moment everyone had realized what had just happened. A dog had brought justice back into the room, and a 4-year-old girl had led him there. Amelia looked up at Shadow and whispered, "Did we save her?" Shadow didn't bark, didn't wag his tail. He simply sat, watching the judge disappear into chambers with the truth clutched in his hands. Because Shadow wasn't here to celebrate. He was here to finish what someone else had tried to bury. And he was just getting started. Talia Monroe hadn't spoken much since the arrest. Not in the courtroom. Not in the holding cell. Not even to her daughter. She sat, wrists in cuffs, back straight. The worn blue of her nurse's scrubs faded under the harsh lights of the county holding facility. Her silence wasn't defiance. It was survival. Words could be twisted. Tears could be weaponized. But silence they couldn't use against her. The only sound she allowed herself was the whisper of Amelia's name when they let her see her daughter once a week. Today was one of those days, and she hadn't expected Shadow to come through the visitation room door. The leash was loose in Amelia's tiny fist, and the dog walked beside her, not in front, not behind, but perfectly aligned, as if the 4-year-old was the commanding officer, and he was just following orders. "Hi, Mommy," Amelia said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Talia's heart thudded so hard she thought it might give out right there. She reached across the table, fingers trembling. But her voice was calm. "You brought him?" Amelia nodded. He didn't want to stay home. Shadow sat, spine straight, ears relaxed but alert. His eyes never left the door. Not once. He was scanning. Even now, always working. He hadn't always been hers. Shadow had once belonged to Officer Matt Tanner, a K-9 handler with the 12th Precinct. Matt was the kind of man who didn't talk much about the job, but always made time for Talia when she worked late shifts at County General. He was calm in chaos, a quiet kind of strong, until he was gone. The shooting had made the news. Wrong place, wrong time, or maybe exactly the right place to stop something worse. The papers said Matt died a hero. They barely mentioned Shadow. No one knew what to do with a retired K-9 whose partner wouldn't be coming home. The department had offered to place him in a kennel program, maybe send him to a veterans therapy unit across state lines. But Talia stepped in. She didn't even think about it. He had been at the hospital with Matt during recovery rounds, waiting outside ICU rooms while Talia changed IVs and whispered promises of survival to burn victims. Shadow knew the quiet codes of grief. He never barked. He didn't demand affection. He simply stayed. When Matt died, Shadow returned to the last place he remembered calm. Talia's door. She never asked why, and he never left. Now he was family. She reached out again, brushing her fingers along his back. His fur was coarse from the Colorado winters, but warm. Grounding. He's been looking out the window every night. Amelia said, "He doesn't sleep unless I'm on the couch with him." Talia swallowed. "They still haven't fixed the lock," she murmured. Number butt Shadow growls when someone walks past the porch, even if it's just the mailman. Amelia giggled. Shadow blinked slowly, his body still, but his eyes sharp. Watching the guard, watching the hallway, watching the way Talia's hands never stopped shaking, even though she was trying so hard to stay composed. A K-9 doesn't forget. They remember routines, rhythms, smells. They remember home. Shadow hadn't accepted Talia because she fed him. He had accepted her because he saw what Matt saw. Strength, even when she didn't see it in herself. The buzzer sounded overhead. 30 seconds left. Talia leaned in, her voice a notch lower than the guard would hear. "Are you safe, Amelia?" The little girl nodded. Shadow sleeps by the door. Jason comes by every night. Jason Beckett, Matt's old patrol partner, now working courthouse security, the only officer who still visited, the only one who hadn't looked at her like she was a monster. He believed her. At least she thought he did. The door opened with a loud metallic clunk. Amelia flinched. Shadow stood, not growling, not barking, but standing like he'd just received an order. "Time's up," the guard said. Amelia hesitated, looking up at her mother. Talia couldn't cry. Not here. Not now. "I'll see you soon," she whispered, even though she didn't know if that was true. Shadow waited until Amelia took a step, then moved with her. Still close. Still ready. As they left, Talia caught a glimpse of his eyes, and in them she saw something that twisted her gut. A warning. Something was coming. Something only he had sensed. Shadow had never brought anything into a courtroom before. Until today. Later that night, Jason Beckett stood outside Talia's small house. The porch light flickered. He adjusted the grip on his holster and knocked twice. Amelia answered the door in fuzzy socks and a mismatched hoodie. Shadow stood behind her, like a sentry. "I thought you might want to know," Jason said. "That file, the one they said was lost in the evidence fire, a new piece just showed up in the system." Talia's heart would have stopped if she had been there. "A box," he continued, "unmarked, from a location that doesn't make sense." He looked at Shadow. "Your boy here's been hanging around the old archive wing, pacing, scratching the same corner." Shadow didn't react, just sat, looking up. Jason knelt down, meeting the dog's eyes. "You trying to tell us something?" Shadow didn't blink, but his paw moved just slightly toward the doorway. And in that moment, Jason understood. This dog wasn't just loyal. He was waiting for the right time, the right place, to bring back the truth. The courtroom was cold, not just in temperature, but in tone. The walls were a dull beige, the air stiff with formality, the scent a mix of old carpet and nerves. Outside, snow had begun to fall across Blue Ridge County, but inside, the storm was already well underway. Shadow lay under the bench beside Amelia, his large frame motionless. But his eyes weren't closed. They never were, not in a place like this. His ears twitched, nose barely moving, watching, listening, breathing it all in. Talia sat at the defense table, her face pale, jaw tight. She hadn't made eye contact with her daughter since being led in. She didn't dare, not while the prosecutor circled like a hawk. On the stand was a man named Reed Callahan, an insurance adjuster. Clean-cut, sharp suit, pressed voice. He was testifying about the night of the murder, how he'd seen Talia at the scene, how her car was parked where it shouldn't have been, how he heard shouting and saw her leave just minutes before the sirens arrived. Shadow shifted. No one noticed at first. Jason Beckett stood at the back of the courtroom, arms crossed. He was listening, watching, and also watching Shadow, because he had seen that posture before, stiff spine, tail flat, eyes narrowing. That was how Shadow reacted to lies. The prosecutor asked another question. Reed answered quickly, with the ease of someone who had rehearsed. That's when Shadow stood. Not abruptly. No bark, no growl. He rose slowly, his muscles coiled, nose pointed straight at the witness stand. Jason straightened, instantly alert. Amelia looked up. "Shadow?" she whispered. Shadow stepped forward once, twice. "Is this animal secure?" the judge asked sharply. Jason moved down the aisle, placing a calming hand on Shadow's harness. But the dog didn't flinch. His nostrils flared, tail low. He was locked on Reed Callahan. Not the judge, not the prosecutor. Only him. Talia turned just slightly, and her breath caught in her throat. She'd seen that look once before. The night Matt Tanner died. Shadow had paced the emergency room hallway with that same quiet fury. He had smelled something then, too. Something that didn't belong. Something that had come back tonight. Jason crouched beside the dog. "What is it?" he whispered. Shadow's head tilted. A low sound came from deep in his chest. Not a growl, not a whimper, something between. Recognition. Jason scanned the witness stand. Reed was sweating now, just slightly. A drop near his temple, despite the room's chill. Shadow took another step, and Reed took one back. "Is there a problem?" the judge asked. The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, I request the animal be removed from the courtroom. It's clearly disrupting proceedings." Shadow let out a single bark. Short, sharp, and everyone froze. Jason didn't move. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady. "With all due respect, I think you should let him stay." The judge narrowed his eyes. "This isn't a kennel, Officer Beckett." "No, sir, but that man on the stand?" Jason nodded toward Reed. "That's the first time I've seen Shadow react like this since the day his partner was shot." The room went still. Reed tried to laugh it off. "It's a dog. He's probably just confused. Or maybe he doesn't like cologne." Shadow barked again, this time louder, deeper. Jason took a slow step forward, fingers on his radio. Talia rose from her chair. "He was there," she said. The room turned. "I smelled the same cologne that night," she said again, more forcefully. "It was on my porch, the night before the fire, the night before everything went wrong." "Objection!" the prosecutor shouted. The judge banged the gavel once. "Sustained, Mrs. Monroe. Please sit." But Jason kept his eyes on Reed. So did Shadow. "Mr. Callahan," Jason said calmly. "Where were you the night before the incident?" Reed faltered. I already said. I was at my office." "You sure about that?" "I have a time-stamped badge swipe." Jason nodded. "Sure, but that building's been under maintenance for weeks. No badge readers online." Silence. Then Jason added, "I know. I was on that detail." The judge looked down at his bench. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Shadow took another step forward. Amelia tugged gently at the leash. "Shadow," she whispered, "it's okay." But Shadow didn't believe that, because he could smell what no one else could. Fear, guilt, and the faint trace of smoke. Not from a fire, but from the clothes of a man who had stood too close to a burning truth. And now it was unraveling. Jason stepped back and met the judge's gaze. "Sir, I'd like to request an immediate forensic review of Mr. Callahan's office, car, and clothing." The prosecutor tried to protest, but the judge cut him off. "Motion granted," he said quietly. "This court is in recess until further notice." As the bailiff moved to escort Reed from the room, Shadow sat beside Amelia, watching, waiting. Not just a dog, but a witness to something no one else could see. "Please, Shadow, not now," Talia whispered through clenched teeth. She didn't raise her voice, didn't make a scene. But there was a plea in her tone that carried the weight of someone trying to hold everything together while it all came undone. Shadow's bark cut through the courtroom again, deep, precise, not panicked, but purposeful. A statement, not a reaction. The judge rubbed his temple. "Remove the animal, immediately." Amelia's little arms wrapped tighter around Shadow's neck as the bailiff approached. "He didn't mean to be bad," she said, eyes wide, tear-glossed. Jason Beckett stepped forward, hand out. "Your Honor, with respect, he's not just reacting, he's alerting. There's something—" "Enough," the judge snapped. "This is a court of law, not a kennel. I've tolerated more disruption than I should have. This dog may be well trained, but he is not an officer of the court." Shadow growled low, not at the judge, but at the bailiff approaching Amelia. Amelia looked to her mother, confused, caught between fear and faith. Talia stood, wrists still cuffed, eyes on her daughter. "Jason," she said softly. "Take him out, please." Jason froze. He looked at her, really looked. Talia's voice didn't tremble, but her shoulders had collapsed in on themselves, like something inside her had already broken. "I can't risk it," she added. She wasn't talking about the dog anymore. Jason hesitated, but then took Shadow gently by the harness and guided him away from the bench. Shadow didn't resist. Not yet, but his ears were high, tail low, breathing shallow. He kept his eyes locked on the man at the witness stand. Reed Callahan, the one no one else seemed to question. The doors slammed shut behind them. Amelia began to cry. Talia turned to look, only for a second, before the guard nudged her forward. It was the softest moment in the loudest room. One tiny girl sitting on the marble floor, wiping her face with her sleeve, as the only thing that had ever made her feel safe disappeared through the door. Talia didn't cry. Not yet. But when she passed Jason in the hallway as he paced Shadow back and forth, she paused. "He knows, doesn't he?" Jason nodded slowly. "He's not barking at shadows." Talia let out a hollow breath. "I just couldn't. Not in there. Not in front of her. She's already seen too much." "You don't have to explain," Jason said. But she did, even if she didn't say it out loud, because by the time Amelia was escorted out of the courtroom, Shadow had already been labeled a disturbance, a threat, a problem. And that mistake, ignoring him, would cost them. Jason noticed it first. The hallway that led from the courthouse basement had been shut off for renovation months ago, but a janitor's cart was parked near the side door. New paint on the walls, fresh scuff marks on the tile. Too fresh. "Stay here," Jason whispered to Shadow, pointing to the bench. Shadow sat, but his body was coiled like a spring. Jason knocked twice on the maintenance door. Nothing. He opened it. Empty room, except for a pair of work gloves resting on the ledge. A small black device, recorder, maybe, was half buried in the trash. Jason picked it up with the edge of his sleeve. It was warm. Someone had just been here. Back in the courtroom, the judge called for a recess. Reed Callahan slipped out the side exit, unnoticed by most, except one. Shadow barked once. Jason turned just in time to see the man vanish down the corridor near the records room. "Shadow!" he called sharply. The dog didn't wait for permission. He launched forward, not aggressively, but on purpose. Quiet, like he was stalking. Fast, but not careless. Jason followed, but they were too late. The back exit door was still swinging when they arrived. Reed was gone. Shadow stood at the threshold, sniffing the air. He let out a low whine and looked back at Jason with something close to frustration. Jason crouched beside him. "You tried, didn't you?" he murmured. "We didn't listen." Shadow sat, shoulders rigid, head low. His silence said everything. Back inside, Amelia sat on the front step of the courthouse, bundled in her oversized coat, hugging her knees. "He's not bad," she whispered to herself. "He was trying to help." Jason approached and knelt beside her. "You're right," he said. "He was." She looked up at him with wide, red-rimmed eyes. "Will they listen next time?" Jason didn't answer, because he didn't know. And inside the courtroom, Talia felt the shift in her chest, a cold certainty. They had dismissed the only voice that couldn't lie, and the truth had just walked out the door. The first time Shadow stopped in front of the evidence locker, Jason thought it was a fluke. The second time, he paused. The third time, he listened. It was nearly midnight in the lower level of the Blue Ridge County Courthouse. Most of the staff had gone home, and the fluorescent lights buzzed like tired bees above the concrete floor. Jason Beckett was down there pulling old case files to cross-check with a new system rollout. Paperwork, the kind of duty no one fought over. Shadow had followed him, unofficially, of course. Jason had learned not to fight that. But instead of staying by the desk like he usually did, the dog wandered. Not aimlessly, with intent. He stopped at a grey steel door at the end of the hallway, scratched once, then again. Jason glanced over. That room's been sealed since the fire, bud. Nothing but melted records and mildew. Shadow growled low. Jason's brow furrowed. He walked over, jiggled the handle, locked. Shadow sat, tail thumping once, then stilled. His eyes never left the door. Jason hesitated, then reached for his keys. Don't make me regret this. The lock clicked. The air that escaped was stale, tinged with soot and damp drywall. Inside, the room looked exactly like he remembered it. Burned files, warped shelves, half the ceiling insulation collapsed. Most of the evidence from the Monroe case had supposedly been destroyed here. But Shadow didn't care about the damage. He stepped in, nose twitching, moving past the debris with surgical precision. He stopped near the far left shelf. One paw lifted, then another. And he scratched. Jason knelt. Behind the collapsed wood paneling, hidden between a cracked crate and a beam scorched black, something gleamed. A small metal box. Jason's heart skipped. The surface was tarnished, but intact. No tags, no labels. He pried it out carefully. It was heavier than expected. What did you find, boy? Jason whispered. Shadow sat back, watching. Jason opened it slowly. Inside were 4 items, a set of photographs. Grainy, time-stamped, but clear enough to show a man outside Talia Monroe's house the night before the fire. Not Talia. Not anyone listed in the trial transcripts. A letter, half-burned. The handwriting shaky, but the name at the bottom legible, Matt Tanner. A USB drive, and a blood-stained button. Jason stared at the contents, the sound of his own pulse in his ears. This shouldn't exist. These weren't in the inventory logs. These weren't in any chain of custody reports. This wasn't evidence that had been lost. It was evidence that had been hidden. He looked at Shadow. You brought me here for this, didn't you? The dog didn't blink. Jason knew what he had to do. 2 hours later, Shadow walked through the front doors of the courthouse, the metal box secured in his mouth. He didn't run. He didn't bark. He walked with the kind of dignity only a dog who's seen too much can carry. Jason followed close behind, flashing his badge to the guard at the entrance. What's in the box? The bailiff asked. The reason she's still alive. Jason replied. The courtroom was packed the next morning. The judge had barely taken his seat when the door creaked open. Amelia was there, holding tightly to the end of Shadow's leash. Shadow moved past the pews, past the whispers, past the eyes that watched him like he didn't belong. He stopped at the judge's bench and placed the box at his feet. The judge looked down, startled. What is this? Jason stepped forward. Evidence, Your Honor. Real evidence. Recovered last night from the archived locker room that was never properly searched. The prosecutor objected immediately. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. That room was declared compromised. Nothing recovered from it can be trusted. Shadow barked once. Just once. The sound cut through the courtroom like a blade. The judge's gavel hovered, but didn't fall. Jason's voice was steady. The photos prove someone else was at Talia Monroe's home the night before the arson. The letter? Written by her fiancé, Officer Matt Tanner. He suspected someone inside the department was watching her. The judge opened the box slowly. Saw the blood-stained button. Jason leaned in. That doesn't belong to Talia, or Matt, but it matches the blazer worn by one of the key witnesses. one whose story never quite fit. The courtroom held its breath. The judge said nothing. Shadow simply sat, waiting. Because justice wasn't loud, it was patient, and today it had a box with teeth marks and the weight of truth. No one spoke for a long time, but everyone understood. The dog hadn't found evidence. He had exposed a lie. The doors creaked open mid-proceeding. Every head turned. And there they were, Amelia Monroe, just 4 years old, with one hand clutched around Shadow's leash and the other gripping the edge of her faded cardigan, stepped into the courtroom like she belonged there. Shadow walked beside her, not led, not pulled. He moved with quiet conviction, his head held high, the small metal evidence box secured gently in his jaws. The weight of the courtroom's gaze didn't faze him. He wasn't there to be admired. He was there to deliver truth. Your Honor. Jason Beckett's voice cut through the silence, steady but loud enough to freeze the prosecutor mid-sentence. I respectfully request a pause in testimony. New evidence has just been brought forward. The judge looked over his glasses. This again? Sir, Jason continued, walking down the center aisle toward the bench. This isn't just evidence, it's the evidence. The kind that was never logged, never tested, never even acknowledged. The kind that someone buried. Shadow reached the front and stopped. Without hesitation, he placed the box at the foot of the judge's bench, then sat beside it. He didn't bark. He didn't move. He didn't need to. Amelia stood quietly behind him, her fingers in his fur. For the first time since her mother's arrest, her shoulders didn't sag with confusion or fear. She stood still, watching. The judge eyed the box, then Jason. Explain. Jason nodded to the bailiff, who retrieved the container and set it on the judge's desk. Recovered from a sealed locker in the courthouse basement, Shadow alerted to it, repeatedly. I opened the panel myself. No logged chain of custody, no incident report. Inside that box are photographs, physical evidence, and a letter written by Officer Matt Tanner before his death. The judge's eyes narrowed. Tanner, the K9 handler? Yes, sir. Shadow's original partner. A murmur moved through the courtroom. The prosecutor stepped forward, face tight. Your Honor, none of this has been validated. It's highly irregular for... Jason didn't let him finish. Fingerprint analysis has already begun. The hair sample was rushed to a private lab, and preliminary DNA results came in just this morning. It's not Talia Monroe's. It's not Tanner's. He paused. It belongs to your key witness, Reed Callahan. Every eye shifted toward him. He blinked, twice, then tried to smile, but it came out all wrong. Me? That's ridiculous. Jason handed over the letter. The judge read it silently. His face changed. The muscle near his jaw tightened. The courtroom, once alive with tension, dropped into a dead hush. Shadow didn't move. Within that letter, Jason continued, Officer Tanner described concerns about someone watching Talia, tampering with her reports, following her home. He believed she was being set up. He mentioned one name specifically. He looked at Reed. You. The prosecutor raised his hands. Objection, this is hearsay. The judge slammed the gavel once. Sit down. Jason held up a bag with the button inside. Found inside the same box, blood-stained, tested positive for human DNA, female, Talia's blood type. The button doesn't match any clothing owned by the defendant or the deceased, but it does match the lapel of the jacket Mr. Callahan wore the night of the fire, as seen in the photos taken from traffic cam footage, also inside the box. Reed stood. That's not possible. That night, You said you were home. Jason interrupted. But your phone pinged 2 towers less than 2 blocks from Talia's house, around the time of the incident. No, Reed said quickly. No, someone else. Shadow stood up. The movement was slow, purposeful. His eyes locked on Reed's, not threatening, not aggressive, just certain, because he remembered, The smell, the fear, the scent that didn't belong outside Talia's house that night. The same scent on the man now unraveling in front of everyone. The judge took a deep breath. "Mr. Callahan, you are hereby ordered to remain in the courtroom until we determine the validity of this evidence. Bailiff, secure him." Reed tried to protest, but the bailiff was already at his side. Amelia reached down and scratched behind Shadow's ears. He leaned into her hand. Jason looked at the judge. "Talia Monroe was set up, Your Honor, and we let it happen because we didn't listen. But this dog, he never stopped tracking the truth." Shadow turned to look back at the crowd, at the rows of people who had dismissed him, hushed him, pulled him out of court like a distraction. Now they were silent, listening. Because a dog had just led a little girl into a courtroom, carrying the truth in his teeth. And it was louder than any testimony ever given. The courtroom had never been quieter. The judge's chambers were dark behind him, the gavel resting in his hand like a weight. He wasn't quite ready to lift again. The box, that box, sat on his bench, open now, its contents photographed, catalogued, and examined under more scrutiny than anything else in the case so far. Outside the courthouse, snow had begun to fall again. Software deceptively peaceful. But inside, something had fractured. "Reed Callahan, you are hereby recalled to the stand," the judge said, voice even but strained. The man stepped forward, slower this time. Not smug, not sure of himself. He no longer held his jacket buttoned or his shoulders high. There was a tremble in his hand, a subtle twitch under his eye. Shadow noticed, and didn't hide it. He rose from his place beside Amelia and moved to the foot of the stand, sitting tall, eyes never leaving Reed. The courtroom allowed it now. No one dared say otherwise. Reed adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat. "I've already given my statement. Everything I saw—" Shadow's bark cracked through the room like thunder. One, sharp, commanding. Reed flinched hard. "Mr. Callahan," the judge said, eyeing the dog, "this court will no longer accept vague accounts. The evidence entered contradicts your previous statements, and forensic reports now place you at the scene during the window of the crime." Reed swallowed. His mouth opened, closed. Another bark, louder. Shadow's muscles tensed, his ears forward, his body angled forward in that unmistakable posture, alerting, not reacting, not panicked, certain. Jason stepped forward. "He knows, Your Honor. He's tracked guilt before. Fear, panic. He's reacting now the way he did when his partner was ambushed and killed. Same breath, same tremor. This isn't just a trained response. This is recognition." Reed tried to speak. I was never supposed to." Shadow surged forward, just enough for the leash to tighten in Jason's hand. A low growl vibrated through the room like a warning bell. "Enough," the judge said. But Shadow wouldn't sit. Not yet. Talia watched from the defense table. Her hands gripped each other so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her breathing was shallow, controlled. But her eyes, they were wide. Not with fear, with hope. Because something was happening. Finally. The prosecutor rose, voice tense. "Your Honor, I think we need to pause for a moment and let cooler heads—" "No," Talia said suddenly. Her voice was calm, but it rang louder than expected. "Let him speak. Let everyone hear it." Reed's eyes darted across the room. He was sweating again. Cornered. Shadow gave one last bark, not as sharp as the first, but lower, drawn out, like he was done waiting. "I was there," Reed finally said, voice cracking. "But I didn't set the fire. That wasn't me. I just made sure her shift report went missing. I altered the call log, switched the files so it looked like she was off duty when she wasn't." "Why?" the judge asked. Silence. Reed looked down. Then, "I owed someone." Jason stepped closer. "Who?" Reed hesitated. "You wouldn't believe me. Try us. A man named Royce used to be with County Code Enforcement. He's not just city anymore, he's in deeper things. He had something on me. I didn't ask questions, I did what he told me to do. The courtroom erupted, voices layered over voices, confusion, shock, disbelief. Shadow stayed right where he was, silent now. His job was done. The judge slammed the gavel. "Talia Monroe," he said, "this court will formally vacate the charges against you pending full review. You are free to go, effective immediately." The words didn't hit her at first. Then they did. And she exhaled for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Amelia ran to her. Talia dropped to her knees, arms wide, and caught her daughter mid-sob. They held each other, unmoving, as if breaking apart might make the moment disappear. Shadow approached, slow and steady. He pressed his head into Talia's side and let Amelia rest her cheek against his back. He didn't need to bark anymore. He had already spoken louder than anyone else in the room. And he'd been right. But not everyone shared in the relief. At the prosecutor's table, Assistant DA Harris stared down at the reopened files, her expression unreadable. Behind her, a court staffer quickly collected documents, too quickly. Jason noticed. So did Shadow. Because while the courtroom was celebrating one truth, another one had just walked out the side door without a sound. Not everyone was happy that justice had been served. Not when it threatened to expose more. Shadow's head snapped toward the hallway exit. His ears stiffened again. Jason followed his gaze, and just like that, they both knew. This wasn't over. The sun hung low over Blue Ridge, casting golden shadows across the porch as Amelia giggled somewhere in the backyard, chasing fireflies with a mason jar and 2 band-aids on her knees. Inside the house, Talia stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing out a mug she hadn't had the chance to use in weeks. The quiet felt strange, too gentle, too temporary. Shadow sat near the front door, head resting on his paws, one ear half lifted. He hadn't relaxed, not entirely. Even with the trial over and her name cleared, he still tracked every sound, every shift in the wind. His eyes followed every car that passed. Every step on the gravel outside made his shoulders tighten for a beat. He knew peace didn't last forever. Jason Beckett had stopped by earlier that day. He'd offered to help reinforce the back fence and drop off some new locks for the doors. Talia had thanked him, but she could see it in his eyes. He didn't believe this was over either. Neither did she. It was nearly dark when it came. 3 slow knocks, not urgent, but wrong. Shadow stood before the sound had even finished echoing, his body low and still, his eyes fixed on the door like he could see through it. Talia wiped her hands and stepped cautiously into the front room. Shadow didn't growl. He just stood there, waiting. She opened the door halfway, her hand instinctively reaching for the base of the door frame where she'd tucked a tire iron behind a plant pot. A man stood on the other side, mid-40s, tall, wind-burned face. His coat was worn, collar high against the chill. His expression wasn't threatening, but it wasn't casual either. "Ms. Monroe." Talia didn't answer. "My name's Mark Jensen. I was part of the team assigned to archive and audit the Monroe case back in the early days, before the fire, before the files disappeared." Shadow took a step forward. The man didn't move. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "But I was part of something, and I didn't speak up. I was scared, and I was wrong." Talia said nothing. Her fingers never left the iron. Mark looked past her to Shadow, then lowered his voice. "I know who orchestrated this. Not just Callahan. Not the DA who turned a blind eye. I mean the person who built the whole thing. The one still pulling strings." Shadow let out a low breath, the sound almost human in its warning. "Why now?" Talia asked quietly. "Because he knows the case fell apart, and he's not going to let it sit. You and your daughter, you're witnesses whether you want to be or not." He hesitated, and I think he already made a move. Talia's eyes narrowed. "What kind of move?" Mark glanced behind him, scanning the quiet street. 3 nights ago, someone torched the garage of a woman who testified on your behalf. She was lucky she wasn't home. There were no cameras, no reports, nothing." Talia swallowed hard. Amelia's laughter echoed faintly in the backyard. Shadow tensed again. "I think someone's cleaning up," Mark said. "And I think you're next." Talia stepped outside, closing the door halfway behind her. "You were part of this. You helped bury what could have saved me. Why should I trust you now?" Mark's eyes didn't waver. "Because I stayed quiet too long, and because you have something I don't." He nodded toward Shadow. "You've got a partner who still believes in truth. I lost mine a long time ago." Talia glanced down at Shadow, who stood like a sentry between her and the stranger. "What do you want?" she asked. "To help you disappear," Mark said. "Temporarily. I know a place. Quiet, secure, off-grid. And then what? We watch, we wait, and we find a way to bring the real one down, permanently." Before she could answer, Shadow stepped toward Mark again, nose twitching as he moved around him in a slow, silent circle. He didn't bark, didn't lunge, but he didn't sit either. He was assessing. Mark let him. When Shadow returned to her side, he looked up at Talia with a steady gaze. She understood. Not yet safe, but not lying. Inside, Amelia called for her mother. "Mom, Shadow's missing the fireflies." Talia looked back at Mark. "If I go," she said, "he comes with us, and you don't speak to my daughter unless I say so." Mark nodded once. "Understood. And if I think for 1 second this is a trap, you'll let him decide." Shadow blinked once, almost like a nod. She stepped back and opened the door wider. "Give me 1 night." "Tomorrow," Mark said. "At dawn. Bring only what you need. We're not coming back for a while." Talia shut the door behind him and leaned against it, breathing shallow and fast. Shadow sat at her feet, eyes on her face. She whispered into the quiet. "I thought it was over." Shadow didn't move, because he knew better. The road up into the foothills was barely a road at all, just dirt, gravel, and a path carved by old tires and bad intentions. Jason Beckett's truck jolted over a rut, headlights cutting through the heavy mist curling around the trees like fingers. Talia sat in the passenger seat, lips pressed tight. She hadn't spoken much since they left before sunrise. Her daughter was safe back at a temporary safe house with a trusted federal contact. But her mind was still with her. In the back, Shadow stood tall, balanced even as the truck bucked beneath him. His nose was working overtime, sniffing the air through the cracked window. He knew this was different. Not just a ride, not just another call. This was the hunt. "This the place?" Jason asked, slowing to a crawl. Mark Jensen nodded from the passenger seat of the trailing vehicle. They had followed him up a winding mile of switchbacks into territory no GPS dared to map. At the crest, they stopped. Ahead sat a sagging structure, 2 stories, roof caved in on one side, windows busted out. What was left of a barn leaned crooked against the main building. It looked dead. But Shadow stepped out first, fur bristling. He wasn't fooled by silence. Jason pulled his weapon. "You sure he's in there?" Mark nodded. "If he's smart, he's below it." "Below?" "There's a system of tunnels. Mining routes from the 40s. Royce's people repurposed it years ago. Server banks, backup drives, physical blackmail files. The entire network's skeleton." Talia's voice cut in. "And you never thought to mention this during the trial?" Mark didn't meet her eyes. "I told you I was part of it. You want this guy buried? We need proof. It's in there. Shadow let out a low chuff and started moving. Jason motioned for them to follow. The house groaned as they entered. Floorboards splintered under their boots, but the foundation held. Barely. Dust clung to every inch of exposed wood. But Shadow was focused on the hallway to the left, past the main stairs and into a narrow pantry with rotting shelves and empty glass jars. He stopped at the far wall, sniffed, scratched once, twice, then stepped back. Jason knelt and found it, a latch, old and rusted, hidden beneath a shelf that tilted just enough to be deliberate. He pulled. A panel of the wall swung open, revealing a steep stairwell vanishing into blackness. They descended slowly. Talia gripped a flashlight like a weapon. Shadow stayed close, muscles tight, every step careful. No barking, no sound, just presence. The air shifted once they reached the bottom. Cooler, mechanical. A distant hum like an old server running on borrowed time. At the end of a concrete tunnel was a room. Inside, rows of shelves lined with labeled boxes, paper files, hard drives wrapped in plastic. A desk with 3 monitors, still glowing, lines of code crawling across the center screen. Jason exhaled. We got him. Then the lights cut. Everything went dark. Back! Jason shouted, raising his weapon. A figure emerged from the corner, fast, masked, a blunt object raised high. Jason fired but missed. The attacker lunged. Talia fell back. Shadow exploded forward. He met the man mid-swing, jaws clamping down on the attacker's forearm before the weapon could strike. The man screamed, a sharp, panicked sound, and staggered backward, trying to shake the dog off. Shadow didn't let go. He dug in deeper, body twisting to pull the man down. Jason moved in, tackled them both. A scuffle of boots, fists, snarls. Then silence. The man was on the ground, breathing hard, face visible now. Royce! Jason handcuffed him without a word. Shadow finally released his grip, blood on his muzzle, chest heaving. Talia stared, shaken. You okay? Jason asked. She nodded slowly. He would have killed you. Jason looked at Shadow. Number he would have killed all of us. Mark emerged from the stairwell with a flashlight. He stared at Royce, then the server bank. You have what you need now, he said to Talia. That drive has everything. Emails, transfers, who he paid off, who turned their backs. Talia walked over and picked up the still warm USB from the console, then looked down at Royce. You tried to destroy my life, my daughter's. You almost did. Royce smiled through cracked lips. And you think this ends it? Talia stepped back. Jason leveled his weapon. You're right, it doesn't end here, but this is where it starts. Shadow stood over the man, not growling, just present, reminding everyone who had actually won. They left the building just as the first light of morning burned through the clouds. Shadow climbed into the truck, watching the house until it disappeared behind the trees. They hadn't destroyed the den, but they'd cracked it wide open. And for once, justice had teeth. It was the kind of autumn morning that made everything feel cleaner, crisper, like the world was trying to start fresh. The courthouse steps were quieter now. No protesters, no cameras, no angry murmurs behind police tape. Just the sound of a flag catching the wind and footsteps, dignified, deliberate, as Talia stepped out into the sunlight. Free. No ankle monitor. No pending review. No more court dates. Exonerated. She held Amelia's hand in one, the final release papers in the other. Jason waited by the car, leaning against the hood, coffee in hand, eyes on her, not as a marshal now, but something closer. Shadow stood beside him, ears perked, tail still, like he knew this moment mattered. Talia paused. The wind picked up, and for the first time in months she smiled. Later that afternoon they gathered at the field outside the Federal K-9 training center. a place where stories usually began with obedience and ended with retirement. But today it was for something different, a ceremony, a medal. The audience wasn't large, just those who mattered. Agents, a few press, the director herself, and in the center a podium dressed with red, white, and blue. Shadow sat front and center, his coat brushed to a gleam, his service vest spotless but no longer zipped. He wasn't wearing rank. He didn't need to. He was the reason they were all standing there. The director's speech was short, but her voice was firm. Some dogs are trained for obedience, some for detection, some for war. But every so often, one comes along whose instinct isn't just survival or service, but sacrifice. She stepped down, holding the velvet box in both hands. Talia knelt beside Shadow, guiding Amelia's little fingers to help open the lid. Inside was a silver medallion shaped like a shield, etched with the words, "Valor beyond duty." Amelia gasped. "That's his." Talia nodded, tears rising. Shadow stayed still, posture perfect, accepting the moment with quiet grace, as if he knew medals meant far less than the lives behind them. Jason stood behind them now. "He didn't just protect us," he said, low enough only they could hear. "He held the line when everything else fell apart." Talia wrapped her arms around Amelia, pulled her close. "We were saved because he stayed." No one said anything for a long moment. Then, without cue, the crowd clapped, not politely, but like something had been restored. Something bigger than just a courtroom win or a mission closed. Shadow didn't bark. He stood, walked forward, and placed one paw, steady and deliberate, on the director's boot. A promise, a gesture, a closing of one chapter and the start of another. Back at the house that evening, Talia tucked Amelia into bed. The girl was already asleep before the second story ended. Jason poured wine in the kitchen, 2 glasses. Outside, Shadow lay at the top of the stairs, head resting on his paws, watching the front door like he always did. But it wasn't about guarding anymore. It was about belonging, about knowing this was home. Talia took a sip from her glass, glanced at the photo on the mantel. Her, Amelia, and Shadow, taken just 2 days ago in front of the courthouse. Not smiling for the cameras, but laughing. Real, raw, free. "You still think he's just a dog?" she asked quietly. Jason looked at her, then at Shadow. "Not for a long time now." Outside, the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting the porch in gold. Shadow raised his head, eyes scanning the trees as if listening for things no human could hear. Then, slowly, he closed his eyes. At peace, at rest, and just before the screen faded to black, these words lingered on the screen. "What's your story with a loyal pet?" Share it in the comments, because sometimes the ones who save us wear fur, not capes. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and support our channel, German Shepherd Stories, where courage has 4 legs and a heartbeat.